ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Skeptics in the Pub. One of the goals of our Skeptics in the Pub series is to discuss the hottest topics of science, technology and society. Climate change, genetically modified organisms or GMOs, and nuclear power are arguably among the hottest topics that you could discuss in Austria, maybe apart from smoking in restaurants. Our guest speaker today is Mark Lynas. He just flew in from London and we welcome him in Vienna. Mark has focused in his work on the just mentioned topic as an author of several books, as a journalist for leading newspapers, as a contributor to a couple of films, and as environmental activist. He authored 6 Degrees, Our Future on a Hotter Planet, a book detailing the effects of global warming on our planet, with rising average temperatures between +1 degree to +6 degrees. However, he is not what I would call an ordinary environmental activist. I became aware of Mark when he announced at the Oxford Farming Conference in 2013 that he had, based on the study of scientific literature, changed his mind concerning GMOs. Once destroying trial fields, he is now supportive of the use of GMOs to feed the world. His inspiring speech is also one of the reasons why I became interested in GMOs. Similarly, Mark suggests that environmentalist opposition to nuclear power had sped up climate change. Today, he will reason about the question how we can try to have a more evidence-based debate about these issues. Before I hand over the microphone to Mark, I would like to make you aware of our donation boxes. We are dependent on you. We depend on you to finance the talks. We would like to pay travel costs and hotel costs for our speakers, and also a dinner after the talk. Also, the advertisement for the talks is not completely for free. But to be honest, we prefer we prefer non-GMO free means of payment. 75% of the cotton worldwide is genetically modified, and also it's used to produce paper for banknotes. And an advantage that even GMO opponents cannot deny is that this means of payment is of course much more quiet than GMO-free coins when thrown into the donation boxes. So, with this, I would like to hand over the microphone to Mark, and we are eagerly awaiting the talk.
Thanks, Stefan. It's nice to see a good turnout tonight. I think we have all the pro-GMO people in Austria in this one room. So please make sure you get home safely because we need you, okay? Now I wanted to start my talk with a photo that I took last April on the March for Science in London. There was a March for Science in Vienna, yes? Yep. How many of you went on it? Pretty good turnout, well done. And I'm sure you found yourselves reflecting on that day why we even need a March for Science. Such a thing has never been needed before. And it's needed because the anti-science people are also on the march, and they're getting stronger. And you can see them strengthening on many issues, whether it's vaccinations or climate change. They don't necessarily know what they have in common. I wouldn't say that the anti-science movement is a united front in any ways, but you can see anti-science thinking coming up through many different political movements on the left, on the right, across the political spectrum. And what I've tried to do in my career is to be pro-science, whatever the issue has been. And it's not been an easy thing to do, and it's required me to change my mind and to apologize and to try and move where the evidence has moved. But think to yourself as I go through this story, what issues have you changed your mind on, which are important? And have you changed your mind because you saw the evidence, because you saw the science differently? Because ultimately nobody's going to be infallible. We're not the medieval pope, right? So we're all going to be wrong about some things. And when we find that out, how you respond is the critical issue. So the anti-science crowd, if you were to characterize it as such, has some very powerful arguments. They argue that science is running out of control, that corporations are conspiring to poison your food and to make your children sick with their vaccinations. They argue that climate change is a myth and we should not cut back on fossil fuel emissions. And they argue most of all and most powerfully that there's some secret cabal, some secret group which runs the world and which you don't know about. And they combine to argue against not just science, but against knowledge itself. Now what you see is this political climate, and you can see it in populist movements right across the world, from Trump to the Five-Star Movement in Italy. They argue that expertise is finished, that we should no longer listen to experts, we should listen to the common people. Now that's not just an anti-science argument, that's an anti-democratic argument. That's an argument of authoritarians. And so ultimately for me, this isn't just about science, it isn't just about evidence, it's about the very foundations of our liberal democracies and the need to defend those. Now I want to start by telling you my story, which Stefan alluded to. So this was me back in 1997, 1998. You can see which one's me, right? I'm the one in the white outfit. And, you know, we were wearing these biohazard suits in order to communicate visually, because this is an action, that there's something dangerous about what we call biological genetic pollution coming from genetically modified crops. So this was us in a field in England preparing to destroy genetically modified oilseed rape, the first GMOs which were being brought into anywhere in Europe at that time. And we also made a plan. And this came out in the Times this weekend. So this is from the media, from the UK media, because they've just been sent the first copies of my book, and I revealed for the first time that we actually had a plan to steal the world's first cloned farm animal, Dolly the sheep. Did you hear about this? Yeah? Did you know that we tried to steal Dolly the sheep? So it didn't work out, because what happened was that 4 of us in the pitch dark went to the Roslin Institute where the cloned sheep was, Dolly the sheep, and one of us got into the shed, and I'd spent the whole day discovering which shed it was. So the protest was to take away, to steal Dolly the sheep as a protest against cloning, right? One of the other protests we wanted to have was in defense of sex the natural way, and have a big shag-in, you know, everyone has sex in the open air to show that we don't support cloning, but that never happened. It was a great shame. That would have been a much better action. Anyway, so we were there under the cover of darkness, and we finally got to the shed, and we opened the door, or the guy who was there, and the shed was full of sheep. I'm telling you, all sheep look the same, right? And if you think about it, cloned sheep look even more the same than normal sheep. So we were unable to identify Dolly, because those clever, dastardly scientists had hidden her in plain sight by putting her in a whole shed full of other sheep. But I think the point was made. This was a secret. This was a well-kept secret for, well, nearly 20 years. And so I wrote about it in my book for the first time because I actually wanted to not spill the beans, but I wanted to explain what it was like to be an anti-GMO activist and what motivated us and indeed how we were so successful. Because you go outside this place here today and how many people would be anti-GMO in the population of this country or Germany or, I don't know, Romania, Italy, France. Basically everybody is anti-GMO. And we started it. And I know where that came from, and I know that it's wrong. And so what I want to tell you tonight, just at the beginning of my talk, is to tell you the story of how I realized that I got this wrong and what the process was for eventually coming out and admitting it. And the way that I realized, and I know this sounds almost ideal, was that I discovered science. And when I was an anti-GMO activist, I didn't know anything about genetics, molecular biology. I didn't even know what that was. In fact, my big fear was that when I was doing a TV interview arguing with a scientist, the scientist would say to me, "Tell me what DNA stands for." And I'd be like, "Oh, no, can't do it, you know, because I didn't even know the absolute basics of any of this." And I think a lot of the anti-GMO kind of superstition, fear-mongering, hysteria comes from a basic ignorance of not just modern molecular genetics, but even, you know, Darwinian evolution, even the notion of what species are. And anyway, so I discovered science in this very room. This is the basement of the Radcliffe Science Library at Oxford University. And I spent 2 years underground in this room. This was actually before the internet was, this is how old I am, it's incredible. So literally I was looking at all these scientific journals on the shelves, you know, brushing off the dust and opening them up. And the reason was that I was investigating climate change. And I wanted to be able to write a book which had scientific validity, because I was traveling around looking at the impacts of climate change, and I was looking at floods and droughts and disappearing glaciers, things like that. But I knew enough to know that data is not the plural of anecdote. And I wanted to know that what I was showing in anecdotes as a journalist was properly representing what the scientific community was showing about the whole global picture. And I was particularly pleased. Look how young I am there. That's in 2000. Whoa. We need anyone doing anti-aging stuff? Just see me afterwards. So this was in 2008. And for my book, 6 Degrees, which you kindly mentioned, I actually won the Royal Society Science Books Prize. And I was terribly proud of this, because I wanted more than anything else to have the sort of some kind of stamp of approval from the scientific community. So this book has like 500 references in the back. Not a single one to a piece of grey literature or a newspaper article, every single one to a peer-reviewed paper published in a reputable scientific journal. So that's what I was priding myself on as a science writer. And of course, there was a lot of people who were, as they are today, in fact, the phenomenon's got even worse, were denying, they call themselves climate skeptics, denying the existence, or at least the seriousness, of human-caused global warming. And my strongest argument, as I thought at the time, was to talk about the scientific consensus. You know, this has been quantified that 97% of the papers that have been published support the theory of human-caused global warming. And 97% is a pretty good number, right? So you have to be pretty confident of your position if you're to go with the 3% in that situation. But of course, people do, as it's a political movement. And I would refer them to statements like this and say, look, this is from the AAAS, the American Association for the Advancement of Science. I'd say, look, the scientific community, the National Academy, the Royal Society, every single reputable scientific institution in the world would make a statement like that, saying that climate change is real and that human activities are causing it. There's no significant dispute about the science of climate change, and that's how we know, because the consensus of all of the world's experts is pretty much on that issue. And so here's why I had a problem, because the AAAS also made a statement about the safety of genetic engineering. Okay? And they said genetic engineering in crop plants is safe. Now, and in fact they use much of the same language. If you look at the beginning, the first sentence on these two slides, it says the scientific evidence is clear. Global climate change is the science is quite clear. Crop improvement using modern molecular techniques of biotechnology is safe. So, where did that leave me? Could I go out and say you must listen to the scientific consensus and that's how you know that climate change is real, but you must ignore the scientific consensus on GMOs, right? Because for some reason or other I feel differently about it. You know, I have an ideological opposition or something like that. So for me as a science writer, that was clearly an inconsistent position. And yet, if you think about it, every Green party in Europe, which claims to be pro-science and defends climate change passionately, will deny the science, the equivalently strong science on GMOs. And how do they do that? How do they do that? Because nobody calls them out, right? Because when you do what I did and speak publicly about it, you get a lot of shit. And this was, you mentioned 2013, so this was some of the media coverage that I got. I did not expect, I made a single speech, I did not expect it to attract the attention that it did. Some of it was positive, but the majority was probably negative. Anyone come across Vandana Shiva? So she's an Indian activist. I would say she's very much a political animal, very much of the left, very much anti-globalization, anti-corporations. She's a huge, huge heroine to all of the green movement and that kind of political part. And she put this tweet out when I made my apology speech. Can you read that? So she's comparing what I said with defending rape. Okay. Can you see the logic there, or at least can you see the sheer offensiveness of that? And this was like retweeted lots and lots of times, and this just goes to show how deep the opposition is and how passionately and morally it's held. This is she's making a moral case for why GMOs are equivalent to rape, which is about, you know, as bad a crime as it can get to violate somebody. And so what she's saying is that genetic engineering is a violation of nature, a violation of something pure. And I think that actually betrays some of the essentialist superstitions underneath the opposition to genetic engineering. It's this idea that it's violating something sacred, violating something pure, because people don't understand what genetics is, and they don't understand that, you know, we share 95% of our DNA with chimpanzees. If you were to move a gene between a chimpanzee and us, it doesn't make us half chimpanzee. These myths that you have about how if you take, I mean, you ask most people, if you take a gene from a fish and put it into a tomato, and they'll say, yeah, that's going to make the tomato taste fishy. Or I had this one in Africa. So the anti-GMO activists in Uganda were going around to ordinary people in the villages, and they were saying, you know what they're doing? They're going to take a gene from a snake and put it into a banana to make the banana long like a snake. And people going, oh my God, this is terrible. We have to stop these crazy scientists. And at least Vandana Shiva, I would give her the credit of being consistently anti-science, because she makes this statement that indigenous ways of knowing, whatever that means, is superior to evidence-based thinking. So she's basically rejecting everything after the European Enlightenment. And okay, that's consistent. At least she's being properly, thoroughly, consistently anti-science in how she's doing this. But would you, I mean, she's, like I say, she's paid tens of thousands of pounds. Yeah, next time can you pay me tens of thousands of pounds, please, for this? Because whatever you get in your little box is not going to be enough, because she's paid like $40,000 to go and do a single speech by these green organizations that can book her. Now, what I object to most about Vandana Shiva is that I can't argue against her, because she looks so Indian, right? She's got that bindi and everything, and she's clearly dressed, and everything about her communicates an Indian and therefore a southern developing country perspective. And yet I know from all of the work I've been doing in Africa and elsewhere that she does not represent a developing country perspective. She represents a Western perspective reflected back at the West via her Indianness. And that's a very different thing. And so if you go and do some genuine research in developing countries, you find out that people, ordinary people, farming people, could really benefit from GMOs. And that's, for me, is the real injustice in this whole debate, is how the people who could benefit, some of the poorest people in the world, are being denied the opportunity to grow these crops because rich Westerners have decided that they're against them. People like this woman here. So this was, we visited Tanzania, this is last year actually, and the country was in the throes of this terrible drought, and you can see in the background, this was her maize crop basically. So she's showing what was left of the maize crop. This is what she has to feed her family with. And the droughts are, you know, this goes back to what I was saying about climate change. The droughts are getting worse and worse because of it's an impact of climate change, global warming. And so how can they adapt? How can they adapt to this? They don't have irrigation. Well, the one thing they could have is a maize crop which is drought tolerant. So it has better genetics which enable it to use water more efficiently, so that she'll still get some yield. They still need some water because it's still a plant, right? But she could get a better yield under drought conditions. And why can't she do that? Because anti-GMO activists basically control and dominate the politics in Africa, just as they do here in Austria and elsewhere in Europe, because many of the links are very direct. The European funding sources which support these anti-GMO groups within Africa promote this kind of ideology, which is all about agroecology, organic, and it's always about anti-GMO. Now I want to give you the absolute latest news here. This was me last Friday in Uganda, and the big news here is that I'm the first person. You know how they often say that there's been 3 trillion meals eaten and no one's ever been harmed by a GMO? No one's even had so much as a headache? You've heard that? Well, I've now been harmed by GMOs because I got a terrible sunburn in this field. This was a confined field trial of maize. It's the same stuff as I was just showing from Tanzania. It's called WEMA, water efficient maize for Africa. And so it's the drought tolerance, but this is also demonstrating insect resistance, because the pest infestations have got so bad now in some parts of Africa, and in Uganda in particular. They've got this new thing called the fall armyworm. So armyworm is so named because it comes like an army and just devastates the whole crop. And people, because they can't afford pesticides, which is how in a modern system you would have to control these things, they actually mix up washing detergent and spray it on their maize crop to try and kill these. That's how desperate they are, because they're tiny, and if you're growing like an acre of maize, you can't go around squashing each one on the leaf. And how do you know how the organic people would control this? Any ideas? No. Copper sulfate's for blight. No, they'd pray. Right? That's the only way. And this woman here really struck me because she had such a fantastic dress on with these big shoulder pads. And she's a local council leader there, and she's also a farmer. She's called Lule Monica, and she was saying, to go back to the prayer, she was saying, I pray that we will be able to get these crops one day. They will no longer be in a confined field trial, but they will actually be able for farmers to use. Now, there's only one example anywhere in the world of a GMO food crop for smallholder farmers which has actually been permitted to get into the farmer's hands. Anyone know which one it is? No? Huh? English. Tell me in English. Eggplant. Yeah. You got it. It's this one. So, everyone heard of BT brinjal, BT eggplant? And so this is one of the beneficiary farmers just showing off his produce. And the really great story about this is that it's enabled these farmers to reduce their pesticide applications by up to 90% or more. So they used to, because this is a tropical country with a lot of rainfall, so the only way to protect against the pest, this fruit and shoot borer, which would destroy their crops normally, was to spray, and they always spray by hand. They don't have any protection or anything. They're just like, you know, a loincloth. They're half naked, and they just spray. They have to go and spray, and they're breathing it in. Then they wash their buckets in the village, you know, in the middle of the village, and all of the contamination happens. So, and they're also using organophosphates and carbamates and some of the very old-fashioned types of more toxic insecticides, which are still available on the market there, which we would not use in European farming. They've been banned, and quite rightly so. But the reality then is that they have a really serious toxic burden from pesticide contamination. And this genetically modified one enables the farmers to stop using nearly so much pesticide. So they used to spray like 100 times per the season. And now they literally spray once or twice at the beginning for some of the different kinds of pests. So that's a huge improvement, right? As an environmentalist, are you in favor of reducing pesticides? Yeah? Like, how much of a... Is this difficult? Do you have to really think about this? So what do you think the environmental groups, the anti-GMO groups, have been doing in Bangladesh? Well, they've been going around visiting farmers like Mohammed and saying, you must not grow this genetically modified eggplant, you must go back to using pesticides. The reason why, being that it's a GMO, and GMOs will make your kids paralyzed. Okay? And this farmer's not stupid. He said, I eat it, and I'm still moving, so fuck off. But that's an anecdote. Okay, let's look at the science. I was just told you about, that's not published data, but let's look at the published data. Let's look at the meta-analysis. Pesticide applications worldwide have gone down by about 40% since the widespread adoption of genetically modified crops. And this, by the way, is only maize and soya, a couple of others. There's no GMO rice, there's no GMO, hardly any GMO potato. So some of the major crops, wheat, there's no GMO wheat anywhere in the world. So some of the major crops, because of the anti-GMO lobby, have never been able to be genetically modified to make you use less pesticide. And of course, the joke is that if you look at the ancestor crops, everything's been genetically modified. Not just your money, but every single fruit, every single plant, every single domesticated crop that you eat has been genetically modified from its original wild ancestor. It has to be, otherwise you would not be able to eat it. So here's a little quiz I like to do. I did this for the school kids, but you can play with me on this, where you have to guess what each of these things is. Now, how many of you are science people? Okay, so I expect you to get every single one of these right. Okay. If any of you cannot get, if any of these you cannot get as a group, you buy me a beer. If you get them all, I buy all of you a beer. Okay. So, which one? What do you think this one is? And you only get one guess, by the way. Which? Passion fruit, wrong. It's a watermelon. Now this one you should know. Everyone knows this one. Maize, very good. That's teosinte. Okay, this one's not too difficult. Banana, very good. And actually, if you go to Africa and you eat some of the highland bananas, they still have seeds in. These seeds are really hard. You can break your teeth on them because most bananas are sterile. They're just clones. So that's what the ancestor looks like. And the one on the right there, it's same family. I'll give it to you. It's aubergine. It's Solanaceae. Yeah. Down there, you can probably get that. Carrot, very good. So it's a nasty-looking root which tasted like shit, and now it's been genetically modified, and it's nice and orange, and it has sugar in and everything else, and more beta-carotene. And of course, on the right, it's horseradish. It's a mustard actually. What you're seeing there is mustard. So it's a brassica. So every single brassica, every cabbage, every cauliflower, every Brussels sprout, all of those are different mutations of the original wild mustard that you would find. So I think you buy me a beer for that. Okay. All righty. So the strongest argument that the anti-GMO people have had is that GMOs are harmful to your health, which doesn't even make sense because there's no such thing as a GMO. Everything's genetically modified, and whether you move a gene in a lab or whether you mutate a gene using radiation or any of the rest of it, there's so many different ways of doing this, and to isolate one single one and say that's going to give your kids cancer or whatever it happens to be is ridiculous. But it's a very powerful argument because it resonates with people at an emotional level. And it's the same thing that the anti-vaccination people do. It's a pretty amazing feat to be able to convince people not to vaccinate their children against diseases, right? How? Why would you want to raise the risk of your children getting a disease which could kill them? And they do that by saying that the vaccination is going to harm your kids more. So to get the risk wrong. And it's the same with genetically modified foods. So they will say, they'll make a spurious correlation. So this is IBD. This is from Jeffrey Smith. You know him? He's one of the cranks in America who makes money out of this nonsense. And so he's linking inflammatory bowel disease with acres of BT corn. That's what's known as a spurious correlation. Okay, and they do that in lots of different areas. If you can get a curve, two curves to meet together, then you can get people convinced about something, even if there's no actual scientific relationship. So this is death rate plotted against glyphosate applied to corn. So they love to have a go at glyphosate, Roundup, Monsanto, something which really gets people excited. Another one, of course, this has been done for organic food. You might have seen this. So there's a good correlation between autism and organic food sales. And even more ridiculous, spurious correlations. There's a whole website about this. I've put the thing on the right there. So per capita cheese consumption with number of people who died by being tangled in their bed sheets. Age of Miss America correlates with murders by steam, hot vapors, and hot objects. I don't know how many people have even... I think the per capita rate of the latter is quite low. And so I want to move on to talk about some of the superstitions that have been applied in other areas and why this is important for the environment. So when I do talks to audiences and I say, which of these would you prefer? Everyone chooses the wind turbine. Now, you won't because you're skeptics, right? You'll all go for the nuclear reactor. You don't want to live there. You want to live right here next to the... right next to that goddamn reactor. And of course, I would always make the case that nuclear has several significant advantages, environmental advantages too, not just advantages in terms of the health. Probably the most obvious advantage is how much energy, electricity, you can produce in a single nuclear reactor. So this is how many wind turbines you need to replace the output of a large, what's this say about about a 1.1 gigawatt nuclear power plant. That's how many. It's like 1,000 or so wind turbines. Actually, there's about that many. I was on the plane. I was really impressed at how many wind turbines you now have dotting the plains around Vienna and probably elsewhere in the sort of lowlands. And I'm not against this. I think this is great, but it's not enough because they're switching these other ones off. And so this is what Germany's done, is they've switched off the nuclear and they've replaced it with renewables, and the carbon emissions have not gone down. Remember, we need to get carbon emissions down to solve climate change. Somebody needs to tell the German Greens that. And of course, wind and renewables, any kind of energy generation has environmental effects. So badly sited wind turbines can kill birds of prey and can affect bats as well. This is not something that you'll see outside every single wind turbine everywhere in the world. So this is very location specific. It depends on the species, it depends on the location and the behavior. But it is real as well, so we can't deny it. And in some places, wind turbines have actually affected the bird populations. And solar plants in the desert have affected desert tortoises and so on. There's no such thing as a ecological free lunch. And if you're using renewables, you have to industrialize a very wide area because you're harvesting energy, very diffuse energy from a very large area. So it has a larger environmental impact. The good thing about nuclear is that it's a very dense, you can't get a more dense energy source than uranium, much denser than fossil fuels even. And of course everyone goes, but the nuclear waste. And so I show this picture, that there's the nuclear waste. It's next to the parking lot out the back. Can you see anyone dead? No one ever died from nuclear waste. So it's one of these things where you have a constructed political argument and everyone goes, but the nuclear waste, as if that's a complete knockdown argument. But actually, I don't give a shit. It's in these big steel canisters. It can stay there for a few centuries, by which time it's not radioactive anymore, and it doesn't really matter. And it doesn't really matter anyway if you compare it on a risk balance basis with the actually apocalyptic threat of climate change. And if we stay scared of the wrong things and we ignore the evidence, then we end up being confronted with being unable to solve the problems which are that much worse. And of course all this comes down to what's known as radiophobia. So the fear of radiation, this unseen thing. And it's it's there with Frankenstein, it's there with everything, this idea that something terrible about radiation. And so I show this because this is the dosimeter showing 0.8. I think it's microsieverts per hour. And this is showing 33. That's a beach in Brazil. This is the Chernobyl exclusion zone. And I'm not just cherry picking. I have actually been to the Chernobyl exclusion zone, and I've been there with a dosimeter myself. Some places are higher. The closer you get to the reactor, the higher it gets. I'm not saying there's no radiation, but what I am saying is that people have a very different response to radiation doses depending on whether they think it's natural or not. And that's what's particularly strange about this. And people even go to that beach. This is in Brazil, and they bury themselves in the sand because they think it helps deal with their arthritis. That's fine. I mean, you can give yourself a bit of radiation, and I don't know, it's fine. I don't have any problem with that. But don't move hundreds of thousands of people out of a zone which has lower radiation, and because you say you're helping prevent them being at risk. Now, Austria has a particularly shameful and embarrassing story over the Zwentendorf, right? Which you all know about. But I like to talk about this because I love to humiliate this country. And it is about the stupidest decision that any country has ever taken in its energy structure. To build one of these things at the current money cost of, what was it, 2-3 billion euro, to even load it with fuel, and then have a referendum, which is run by the idiots in the Green Party, only by 40,000 votes, and then they don't switch it on, and instead, you build a coal plant. And the Greens go, well, that's great, we love coal, and they go away. And, how many, did I do the figures here? 165 million tons multiplied by so, my guesstimate is, if you look at this as a whole, the anti-nuclear environmental lobby is probably responsible, and this is a really stupid, I should never say this, but probably responsible for like 10 to 20% of global warming from because of coal. Like, it's quite possible, and obviously this is a counterfactual. I can never prove this, but there was thousands of nuclear reactors proposed in the 70s, and they all got cancelled, and some of them even got converted to coal, just like happened at Zwentendorf. But they even took the building, took the reactor out, put a coal-fired burner in it, and that's been the case. And it sits there emitting millions of tons of CO2 per year for the next 30 years, and nobody says anything. Greenpeace didn't care about that until about 5 years ago. I mean, they're campaigning against coal now, and that's great, and I support them 100%. But they've been defending coal since the 1970s by getting nuclear off the system. And they're still doing that now in Germany. I mean, look at this. This was Germany's newest big coal plant. Big green button. Isn't that great? It's the only thing that's green was the bloody button, because the thing is burning not just black coal, lignite, brown coal. Yeah, brown coal, which they get from these huge open cast coal mines. They even get rid of, they destroy the forest, they destroy the medieval villages just to get this brown coal out of the ground. How can you do that and call yourself an environmental or climate leader? It's a joke. And of course, we come back to global warming all the time. Well, how are we going to solve this if we don't have clean energy? And you can't just get clean energy from renewables because it's too small and it's too intermittent and it has these problems. It's a big potential, but it's not good enough. And people will say, well, Chernobyl, there's me at Chernobyl. I did tell you I've been to Chernobyl, right? I'm wearing the same shirt. And how many people died at Chernobyl? Ask Greenpeace, they'll tell you it was like 100,000 or something. I mean, that's what most people think. If you did a straw poll on the streets of Vienna, you would probably get an estimate which is considerably higher than that, which is supported by scientific evidence. And so the consensus is that are roughly about, in terms of actual provable deaths, it's about 50 from Chernobyl. Several thousand injured. What I mean by that is thyroid cancers. So they were almost entirely treatable. It's not good having thyroid cancer, and it was easily preventable if they'd given iodine tablets and the Soviet Union hadn't tried to cover it up and all the rest of it. But let's be honest, that's what happened. But people get the deaths from nuclear wildly out of proportion, unlike the deaths from coal. Remember this disaster in Turkey, which killed 274 people. Nobody remembers that. How many people remember Soma, honestly? How many people remember Chernobyl? Come on, all of you put your hands up. You've all heard of Chernobyl. Huh? Don't lie to me. And let's look at the comparison with the great German organic bean sprout disaster of 2011. You remember that one? I liked it. I mean, I didn't like it. It was a tragedy, but I liked it in the sense that it had the same death toll as Chernobyl, which is about 50 people, and several thousand cases of the kidney disease which come from these E. coli outbreaks. So really serious thing. And what happened? Did they shut down the organic industry? Was every single organic farm, roped off with police tape and forced never to open again? Because that's what they tried to do with nuclear power. No, it's gone away. It was forgotten about. It was hushed up. They never really even got to the bottom of where the contamination had come from. And so if you look at these things, the only way to do this in a scientific way is to look at it in a kind of per capita sense. So what are the deaths per gigawatt year or something? So try and get it all on the same scale. And of course, coal is at the top, absolutely. Not just because of the actual deaths of coal miners in these huge collapses and fatalities, but because of the particulates and because of all of the other pollution that comes from coal, which is very dangerous to human health. Coal, of course, even emits more radioactivity. You know this? You get more radiation from coal plants than you do from nuclear plants, because of trace isotopes in the coal, which comes up in the dust and the ash. So coal, that's the worst thing. Oil, natural gas. Solar, you know why solar's slightly more dangerous than some of the other ones? The clue is in the rooftop. Seriously. Hydro is, if dams burst and they can sweep away a couple of thousand people, luckily it doesn't happen very often, but that's where the death rate comes from hydro. And nuclear, so this is even including Fukushima or including Chernobyl, is probably down at the bottom. I mean, there's enough uncertainty at this level that it doesn't really matter. They're all very safe. Renewables are very safe sources of energy, no doubt about it. But so is nuclear. And I make a career out of being a tourist in nuclear power disasters. So I also went to Fukushima. This is from the film Pandora's Promise, if you can ever get hold of that. So it's a kind of the first pro-nuclear film made with environmentalists. And so there's the Fukushima plant. Here's me with my dosimeter. This was the other time I wore a hazmat suit, since I was a GMO activist, by the way. Completely unnecessary, but it was a condition of going into the exclusion zone that you wore this suit. Now, one of the things that really made me angry was seeing how some of the so-called environmental groups exploited this disaster for their own gain. The Rainbow Warrior, the Greenpeace flagship. So this was the tweet that they put out, throwing flowers in the sea in remembrance of the victims of the 20,000 lives lost 5 years ago. So this must have been when was it? Was that 2013 that happened? 2011? Was it 2011? Okay, so this must have been in 2016 that they put this tweet out. It's more recent than that. And look at the hashtag, Fukushima. 20,000 people dead, hashtag Fukushima. But they're clever enough not to actually say it. They're just implying it. Because how many of those 20,000 people died from radiation? No, 0. Everyone died from drowning or from the earthquake. So that, ladies and gentlemen, is what's commonly known as a lie, right? It's not just Donald Trump who does post-truth, it's Greenpeace. And yet we all think of Greenpeace as the good guys. That's why you can't point to Donald Trump, and Donald Trump is the biggest, fattest, orangest liar in the world, there's no doubt about that. But you can't point to Donald Trump and accuse him of lying when your own people who you think are the good guys are also engaging the same things. Science isn't something you can pick and choose. And the same goes for hold on, we'll talk afterwards. The same goes for climate change, of course, as well. So this Senator Jim Inhofe, who took a snowball onto the floor of the Senate and said, "Hey guys, I got some snow here. This shows global warming's not real, yeah? Ha ha, fucking ha." Now, to any ordinary person, maybe it does. If it's still snowing, if it's really cold, then maybe global warming doesn't exist. Because if you think about it, how many of us actually can say that we've experienced global warming in a meaningful way? Right? How can you prove global warming? No anecdote either way, even if it's hotter, that doesn't prove global warming. The only thing that can prove global warming is data. And by data, we mean average temperature, the average global temperature over a long time period, so many, many decades. So how many people anywhere have personally experienced a change in average global temperature over many decades? Of course, the answer to that is 0 as well. So only data. So that's why it's difficult to understand, is that when the data conflicts with your personal anecdote always wins, because that's what you see in front of your eyes. And we've evolved to believe what we see in front of us and what people who are close to us tell us. So there's the data, Jim Meinhof. But which is more convincing? I think you can see this in vaccination, in the vaccination debate as well. Anti-science populism, I would say, doesn't completely cut across the political spectrum. I think it's on the extremes. I think you can see it on the lefty sort of hippies, and you can see it on the I don't know whether the 5-star movement is a left-wing thing. It's kind of popular, so it's across lots of different. It's basically stupid on lots of different issues, because it basically, I don't know. And of course, I'd put tweet. This is Trump's tweet about that. So, I don't think Beppe Grillo and Donald Trump have much politically in common, except their ignorance and their populism. And so Trump got on this thing as well about, and he's talking about the MMR vaccine here, the MMR autism, which did enormous damage. And that's probably one of the best examples of bad science and the real damage that it can do in the world. And if you look at the gaps between the public and the experts, I've got climate change on here, so there's a 37% gap between the 50% of the public and the 87% of the experts. Why that's not 97, I don't know, but there's always a bit of an error on these things. But what was interesting about this chart, this was from the Pew Center. Do they have vaccination? Oh, there we are, childhood vaccines. So actually there's quite a small gap, but there's still some gap between the experts and the general public on that. Biggest gap of all, 51 points. It's even bigger here in Austria, guys. Well done you. Is on the GMO issue. Because the majority of the general public believes that GMOs are unsafe. Right? Even though, I mean, this was just a straw poll of the AAAS, so like that and that are about the same in terms of the scientific consensus on the safety of GMOs. And where does it come from? What's the political, how would you say, the political push that leads to these kinds of attitudes? I think it's quite well summarized in this cartoon. And there is something about that, right? There's something about this idea that the common man, we should respect the opinions of the ordinary person, because there's something appealing about that. So the anti-intellectual, anti-expertise, which has become really a kind of a zeitgeist. That's a German word, isn't it? So it's become a zeitgeist of the modern age, that we should listen to normal people. That actually happened to me on the plane. I stood up. I tried doing it. Who thinks I should try? No. I also think that there is a competing worldviews issue here as well. And Steven Pinker's written this book called Enlightenment Now, which is a very passionate defense of what he considers to be Enlightenment principles. So the idea of reason, evidence, progress, a belief in progress. Who believes in progress anymore? Well, you might, but that's because you're weird. You say, yeah, I'm weird. Steven Pinker did this talk. You can see it on YouTube. Why do progressives hate progress? It's quite a good challenge, because actually I don't think that the progressive, to sort of centre left, I don't think people believe in progress anymore. People don't believe that life is getting better in any measure, in any way, shape, or form. Yeah, and Pinker has a whole book full of like hundreds and hundreds of charts which show everything from extreme poverty to maternal mortality to violent crime, and all of these things actually have got better. I think the mistake about that is to think that it gets better somehow by itself. Actually, it gets better because you have social movements, you have passionate people, like you can see now with the young people who are organizing against for gun control in the United States. It won't happen otherwise. So all of these things that have got better because people have stood up and demanded that they should get better. And that's the important thing to remember here, is that these demands have to be made using science. They have to be evidence-based. But ultimately they do depend on values, and they depend on morality which I think is the thing that we do all have in common, and that's what you do get from the grassroots, and that's where democracy comes into the being as well. So to come right round in a circle, I think that anti-science groups corrode trust not just in our scientific institutions, but in democracy itself. And that's, of course, what the Kremlin, what Putin has been trying to do around the world, which is why they support the fascists and they support the Greens. They support anyone who can divide and undermine and corrode public trust in truth. If you can get rid of truth, then the powerful people stay in power. So the only antidote to power, the only defense of democracy, is to demand that evidence is taken seriously and that truth gets taken seriously, and we do not give in to this post-truth world. Thank you very much.
Questions?
Following question. As an anti-GMO person, why do they think that something like breeding dogs, like pure breed dogs like pups, why is that okay, but changing a plant a little bit, why is that a problem? How can they look at an animal that can breathe and say, that's completely fine with me, and corn is bad?
You know, if a dog was not genetically modified, you would not let it anywhere near your children because it would be a wolf, right? So you could try telling them that, but it's a difference, I think, in people's minds between selective breeding, so, you know, generation after generation after generation of selective breeding, which is how the dog can mutate into something with a flat face which can't breathe, and doing it in a lab. So I bet if you took a wolf and you put your science thing and you got a test tube and you did the weird things that scientists do behind closed doors and you came out with a Dachshund, people go, for fuck's sake, that's a Franken dog, you know, Frankenwolf or something. So yes, but it's about the perception, it's about familiarity, and it's about the perception of one thing being okay because it's been there for a long, long time. And that's, in some ways that makes sense, right? If you've been eating a food type for 1,000 years, it's probably quite safe, probably okay. And maybe if the scientists are doing something new and they're putting it, you know, you could make a bad GMO, absolutely. You could take some allergen from, I don't know, from peanuts or soybeans, you could put it into wheat and that would make wheat allergenic. That's been done. Well, not that exactly, but it's been proven that can be done. So my defense is not to say that all GMOs are always good, which is what sometimes people think, but to say that we can understand this. Science can tell you more precisely what you're doing with the GMO, because what I think is more crazy than the dog example is that the Greens and the organic people accept mutagenic crops, so you can subject the genome of a crop to radiation or chemical mutagenesis, and God knows how many double strand breaks and mutations you make in this, yeah, and you come out with grapefruit or durum wheat or some better kind of rice or any of these mutagenic things, and they can even be labelled organic. So they've been way more genetically modified in all sorts of ways which are really not understood, and yet a precise genetic modification, and you see this particularly with gene editing, with CRISPR now coming up. The antis are very against CRISPR. They're very against precise gene editing, yet imprecise gene editing using the kind of scattershot, shotgun approach of mutation breeding is fine. So it's the precise opposite of what would make logical sense that the organic lobby is currently insisting on.
Well, on the other hand, an often said argument was or is that actually the imprecisions in the old techniques of genetic modification, but now with CRISPR it's very precise, and now this argument seems to be forgotten.
Well, they make the same argument.
Yeah.
The precise is imprecise. Yeah. Black is white. Freedom is slavery.
You have My question is because that biotechnology is generally accepted. Recombinant vaccines, recombinant insulin, recombinant factor VIII for hemophiliacs, and so on. This is accepted. In green technology, biotechnology is not accepted. Do you have any explanation for it?
No, not really. I mean, I can guess, but I can't prove what the explanation might be, because none of this is logical, right? So this is my point all the way through, is that the concept of the GMO is not logical anyway. You can see that from mutation breeding. And making insulin from genetically modified yeast or E. coli is still, that is, I mean, it's a GMO, but it happens behind closed doors and it's in a contained facility. Maybe that's one reason. The second reason perhaps is that when it comes to food, people want authentic, local, old-fashioned, right? When it comes to medicine, they want the most fucking modern thing they can get, which is like the most recent treatment that you can possibly pay for, even if it costs millions of bucks, because everyone knows instinctively that's more likely to be helpful than something they used to do in medieval times. You know, we don't use leeches anymore. You see what I'm saying? So actually, I think there's that instinctive thing. Yes, please give me modern technology when I'm sick, but when it comes to what I'm eating, I want the most authentic, local, organic, old-fashioned. Maybe, it's just a guess. I've got no stats in question.
Yeah, so, right, you've got a lot of environmentally people that understand all these environmental arguments here, I guess. And still, if you ask them, probably 80% have been on an airplane last year. And that's a bit of a...
Last year, I was on an airplane this morning. I can talk to you about that.
Right.
Yeah.
But that's a bit of a different thing, right? On the one hand, you have like GMOs, people are scared of it and they don't want to hear the science because they are scared. On the other hand, you have people, they don't want to hear the science, they don't want to know that air travel is bad for the environment because they like EasyJet weekends in Barcelona. How do you get over that problem? Like, not people are scared of science, but people don't want to hear the science.
The way that people make their minds up about these things is through cultural processes, right? There's been a lot of social psychology research on this. It's not that anyone thinks I'm anti-science. What they respond to is a constructed narrative amongst their peer group, and which is about their cultural affiliation. So if you're a green, you're anti-GMO. I tried being a green who was pro-GMO, and it didn't really work out. I was kicked out of the Green Party. You know? It was like you can't choose. So labels include lots of different things, like a bumper sticker. It shows your affiliation. And climate's the same, by the way, much more so in the US. But you can tell somebody's stance on gun control and abortion more closely with their climate change opinion than you can with any other issue. So it becomes about a cultural identification, a sort of political affiliation, your badge, your tribe. So it's kind of a tribalism thing, which is a bit different to not wanting to think about CO2 when you go on a plane. I didn't like to think about the CO2 when I came on the plane this morning, and I'm a climate change. We have a joke actually that the place you meet most climate change activists is Heathrow Airport. And I'm like, no, sometimes it's Gatwick as well, you know. But it's true, we all do it. So, you know, I'm standing in front of you as a total hypocrite. Because what can you do? The way the world is, you get faced with these paradoxes all the time. So you can try to resolve it, you can try to be as consistent as possible, but you can never be 100%, or even anything close.
It's my fault. I increased your ecological footprint.
Yeah, I didn't want to come. I didn't want to come to Vienna. What's the point? he forced me.
In your opinion, why did the people are losing trust in science or in progress? Is it a matter of education, or did science promise too much and they're disappointed, or is science too complicated already so that it's more like magic to them than so they really can understand what's going on?
Yeah, probably. Read Steven Pinker's book, because he has a whole sort of thing on this. But yeah, science is magic that's explained, if you like. And some of those explanations are not as exciting or compelling as the old explanations that people had. So, you know, progress is a political concept. It's a political narrative. And you know, I'm a believer in progress, because without progress, without medical progress, I wouldn't be here. I mean, so to be consistent, you know, my wife had a difficult labour with the first child and had a cesarean, like emergency cesarean. That's modern medicine. Without modern medicine, I would have no son and no wife. Therefore, my daughter, who came afterwards, wouldn't be there. I got pneumonia about 7 or 8 years ago and had to have big intravenous antibiotics injection. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here. So there'll be no Lynas family, which would be a total disaster for the universe. The whole of cosmology will be in mourning about that. So that's why I defend progress, because you know, you can be intellectually critical of modernity, consumerism, think we've lost touch with nature, and there's something to all of those things, but you do also have to remember the good parts, which is that we're all alive, and we don't have to watch half to a third of our children die before the age of 5, like they had to in old times. And you know, the death of a child, I don't think there's many things that are much worse than that. We just had a child who was killed in a traffic accident 2-3 days ago in my village, and everyone's walking around unable to speak. And to think that that kind of mourning, that kind of, you know, every single death, just because there were lots more of them in previous centuries, I don't think it was any easier. So that's why I defend progress.
So first of all, thank you for your nice presentation. My question would be about, could you give any advice how to communicate with these people so that communication is we can all agree on the scientific evidence, I guess, but it's a problem to communicate all these things with the broader public. So could you give any advice through your experience you made in your life?
Well, I mean, my whole life experience is an attempt to do that. So I'm presenting you with the contradiction of saying, and you know, so many people, if you're going to talk about the GMO issue, so many of those same anti-GMO people would passionately defend the scientific evidence on climate change. And you could say to them, well, the scientific community says that GMOs are safe for the way, and are you cool with that? No, because the scientists are part of a conspiracy, they're being paid by Monsanto. You know, and you get exactly the same denialist memes that you get from the climate skeptic side, and you can point that out to them, and maybe a little bit of it filters in. But those are only two different issues. Like I say, these attitudes come from politics. You know, why have you not got a single political party in this country which can defend science on GMOs? I mean, because nobody goes out there and shouts about it. It's almost like, and it's the same with nuclear in Germany. You know, you can't. It's not acceptable in polite conversation. I mean, the word for that is hegemonic. It's become hegemonic, the anti-science attitude on these issues. And the only way to combat that is to speak about it and to make it acceptable, to build a movement. This is why I talked about the March for Science, to build a movement which defends reason and evidence. And to see because I bet a lot of people who were on the March for Science were defending climate change science much more than on GMOs or anything. But the fact that they were walking, you know, hand in hand with the same banners made people realise for the first time, I think, that whatever their politics, the defence of evidence, the defence of science, and the defence of reason was something that they really had in common.
Normally there's always some kind of lobby or money behind all these things. Otherwise, why do all these NGOs and Greens, why are they against these genetically? I don't really get where there must be some money or something behind that. Otherwise, why?
Well, perhaps, but you know, is organic bigger than conventional agriculture? No. It's about 5% or something, so yes, it's like a multi-billion-dollar industry, but I don't think that's what the motivation is. I think it's ideological, primarily. So I don't want to be conspiratorial about it and say they're doing it, you know, they're doing it for the money because they get paid. I mean, yes, there's a lot of money in African terms that goes into these NGOs from European donors who all say, I mean, the European Parliament approved how would you say, piece of legislation saying that they should never support any GMOs in African countries. You know, for me that was outrageous. That kind of colonialism. It's the same as the US Republicans refusing to fund anything which has an abortion, any kind of family planning or anything which has abortion in it, to try and project those values onto people who will be really harmed by it. I thought it was terrible. But yes, it's. I mean, look. Who pays me? Huh? It's not Monsanto. I never took a penny from Monsanto, but I get paid to do this work.
Yes,
So,
we do.
Well, everyone needs to get money. I just had a pizza upstairs. Who's going to pay for that? So we have to, you know. You paid, right? The bill is still open if anyone wants to. But so to be fully transparent, my work in Africa is with Cornell University through the Alliance for Science. Most of the funding for that comes from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And, you know, and I'm proud to talk about that because their interest is to improve health indicators and to reduce extreme poverty. So that's something I feel good about. So, but I would like to see more transparency across the board on this.
I have questions about the two pictures, Chernobyl and Brazil. First, when were they made? Second, where in Brazil? And the third, why is it so much higher? I think it would be reasonable that they were the same, but so much higher?
Yeah, I mean, that is not an average reading across the Chernobyl exclusion zone, and there's places where it's much higher. Same in Fukushima, I got readings which are much, much higher than the Brazilian beach. But that was in, when was the disaster? Was 2013. That was in 2011 the disaster was. I went back a year or two later, so it's still quite high. And so these radiation readings, that's gamma radiation, probably from cesium, are changing all the time, and they're reducing all the time because of the half-life. What the reading is on the beach in Brazil is from thorium, so the sand is black. So there's a lot of natural radioactivity around there, and it's particularly concentrated in those areas. So I don't know exactly what the particular isotopes are, but that was a real reading, and it's a lot higher than you know. So the readings that the Japanese government said you must evacuate the area after Fukushima were much, much lower than the reading you get on that Brazilian beach. So all I'm saying is that people don't evacuate the naturally high radioactive areas. And the reason for that is because it's natural, even if it's still the same amount of radioactivity. Is that okay?
Where in Brazil?
Guarahana Beach. I think I could. It's well known actually. You can find it. Yeah.
Peter.
Thank you for the talk. My question would be, in my opinion, there is this split up between people that have the, let's call it, eco-modernist approach to fix ecological problems by technology, and those that have this eco-primitivist approach to go back and hope it will not get that worse again. So, and the last one is much more attractive, obviously, to people. Why ever? Do you think that there is, or do you have any ideas how to communicate that? So that because of a lot of people that have this eco-modernist approach to ecology are science people or technologists themselves. So this is obviously something that is not going into a broad public.
Yeah, I mean, I'm one of the co-authors of the Eco-Modernist Manifesto, so you would expect me to defend that. But I think it comes back to the worldviews issue. So the progressive worldview is that you can use science to solve problems, and you can make the world better. And maybe the solutions will cause new problems, but you can solve those in turn. I think the primitivist, back to nature view is more that we should step away. We should stop interfering with the earth. We should let nature kind of take its course in some way. But you still find those people travelling on planes and using modern medicine. I mean, how many primitivists you know who refuse to use anaesthetics when they have a... That's the real test. When you see the saw coming or the drill going into teeth, no anaesthetic, please. I'm a primitivist. So I think it's more, even though it's more appealing, and the reason why it's appealing, I think, is because it's conservative, it's backward-looking. So it's nostalgic, it's comforting, things were better in the past. And that's a very powerful sort of emotional instinct. All of us think that things were better when we were children, right? you know, the world was more fun. It just was, right? There's more snow. The summers were warmer. It was just better. And so I think that's a very instinctive.
Less work to do.
You just lay around all day. There was no work to do. You weren't in the rat race, having to earn money and so on. Anyway, I'm just saying that that's a very appealing political narrative, the one looking backwards, and it's been used for all sorts of, terrible ways. Like we were talking earlier, the anniversary of the Anschluss was, 2 days ago or something? Yeah. And you know what, I'm not in any way comparing environmentalism with National Socialism, but the appeal of the going back to the medieval, that was a very strong part of many different political movements right across the spectrum. And because it's such a powerful thing to look at the past and to imagine that life was better and we need to somehow go back there to capture the authenticity and the purity of how things used to be before modernity and technology came along and divorced us from our essential, what's essential about us. And so I think it's a very powerful political movement to be conflicted and to be negative about science and about progress, because those things are new and they're scary, and it's much easier to be conservative and backward looking.
Elizabeth?
Did you talk about Brexit now? Did you?
No. What's Brexit? I never heard about Brexit.
I just wonder what do you think will have, what effect will Brexit have on science, really? In England, for instance. It will have, I suppose.
What effect it'll have on science?
Yes.
The negotiations are still ongoing, and our very intelligent political leaders will no doubt come out with a Brexit which fulfills both needs to maintain a common and open market and secure borders with providing a blah 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 blah. Who the hell knows? No one has a clue because we don't know what's going to come of it. I mean, they even talk about the GMOs, or maybe England could grow its own GMOs after Brexit. I mean, I actually don't care.
Yeah.
I think there's some bigger fish to fry than that.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
There are some initiatives to have mandatory labeling for GMOs. Do you think that is something to be opposed to, or could it maybe even have a positive effect? Because you can say, look, it's everywhere, it's here and there, everything we've eaten, basically, it's a GMO.
Yeah, I support labeling, even though there's no scientific case for it. So I support it for political, strategic reasons. I mean, it's been done where they even say, do you think, they do a poll, do you think that DNA should be labelled? And people go, yeah, DNA, don't want that in my food, terrible stuff. And so, again, it's a constructive political narrative, but one of the strongest arguments that they can make is there's something secret. The corporations or whoever, the scientists that put something into your food and it's not labelled, and they don't want you to know. And so that leads you to think conspiratorially. It leads you to think if it's secret, then it's probably going to be risky. So it makes you feel it's more dangerous. So I would much prefer to see full transparency. And you can say, yeah, it's on the label. It's got DNA, like 80%, all that's DNA in it. But the scientists, it annoys the scientists because the biochemistry is no different. So, GMO sugar is still CHO. What's sugar? Come on, you'll go. Anyway, there's no GMO thing which makes the molecular structure any different. So the chemistry is the same between GMO food and non-GMO food, which is why it doesn't make any sense to talk about GMOs, right? Like, is it BT maize, or what's the trait? What's the gene? What's the protein it's doing? All of that kind of basic stuff, to even to bring it all into the same. So that's another reason why GMO labeling doesn't make any sense. With a big, they want a big skull and crossbones with a GMO in the middle. So I don't think that's a good idea. But actually, I would quite like to be able to say, this came from BT maize, which is an insect resistance trait, which reduced the use of pesticides by 40%. That's better than organic, by the way. Yeah.
I was wondering about your remarks on democracy. So if less and less people are convinced by scientific or evidence-based arguments, so they become more and more of a minority. So how does that go hand in hand in saving democracy? Well, apparently it seems at odds with democracy and science if less and less people are convinced by that. Yeah,
my point was that that to hold power accountable, you need to have a shared standard of truth. And that's what Trump has been very good at, is to poison the very idea of truth with this whole idea of post-truth and fake news and everything. You can point to it so nobody knows what's true anymore, and the powerful people can do what they want. And democracy can't function because you don't have accountability. And so the corroding of the institutions of democracy, whether it's the media, whether it's formal institutions, I think is what's same. It's a part of the same phenomenon as we get with the anti-science and the opposition to the knowledge. So the populist thing of saying, hey, ignore experts. We all know we all know the truth. We all know that GMOs are bad. Ignore the scientists. That, I think, is the same way. That's anti-democratic, essentially, because if you throw away truth and you throw away evidence, then the powerful people can just do what they like. And that's why this has been a phenomenon in Orban in Hungary. Putin, absolutely, he's pushed it right away across the world, in America as well, Poland. So all of the movements towards authoritarianism are post-truth movements, because they depend on lies and they depend on these kinds of memes which reject evidence, because that's the only way they can be held accountable.
So, question related to a couple of other things that come out.
Sorry, speak up.
Yeah, question related to a couple of other issues that have come out. So, what do you think that is the role of more aggressive policy of science communication? So, we have seen how these movements just make their point of view, as you said, hegemonic. So it's just everywhere, and if you speak against them, you're labeled as bad or as inconvenient or whatever. So do you think that people who are more scientifically oriented should take this same perspective or this same behavior and start labeling people who do not conform to scientific evidence as anti-scientific or anti-progress? Right?
Yeah, I think you have to, and that's why the March for Science was important, because it was a political defence of evidence and reason and science itself. I mean, you had the mass homeopathic overdose. You know, that's a great example of a piece of activism which defends science, because it ridicules the irrational beliefs of homeopathic medicine. And, you know, we could do the same with GMOs. We could have a mass eating and then pretend to die. I don't know what. I mean, as an activist, you can think of things you can do, but you have to play the game of appealing to people. You have to make an effort to appeal to people. You've got to sell science to the general public. You can't just lock yourself away in academia and look down on people. So you do have to remember not to be patronising, and not to imagine that experts have the answers to everything, and that we should have only there's the idea that experts should rule us, scientism as they call it. You know, democracy does mean that the whole public has to be informed and has to participate in the political life of the country. So I'm not arguing for elitism. It's in many ways, it's the authoritarians claim elitism in order to defend their power grabs, and that's why it's very difficult to really see what's really going on in societies. But you have to organise. If you want to confront the hegemony of lies on GMOs or nuclear, you have to get out there and shout about it. You have to have arguments. You have to have the courage to stand up for truth, right? You know it's true because you've looked at the science, and science is the only way you can properly assess the evidence for and against any of these things, right? So, yeah.
But that's the issue with academia, right? I mean, the expression ivory towers of knowledge exists for a couple of decades already. So, I mean, that's the issue, that the knowledge is still hidden away behind the walls, and that, it's just not spread it. You know?
That's what we try here.
Well, yeah, exactly. What you're doing here is science communication, and you have to, we have to try and expand that as much as possible. And science has become more open than it used to be. When I started off my 6 degrees, like I was saying, I was the only place you could get peer-reviewed journals was in that shelf, and you could only get access to the library by having a card and going through a lot of hoops. And now there's this whole huge open source movement. I mean, in some ways, science has become overly democratized. You've got way too many like pay-for-play journals and all the rest of it. But I'd rather it was open than as closed as it was before. And I think with blogs and just the general social media, that scientists themselves have realized that they have to become better communicators. And you know, scientists have to remember how to be human again. And that's, I think, begun to happen, and that's very welcome.
Yeah, you say there's a scientific consensus on that we have no evidence currently that GMO does any harm to us. Now, I agree with this, but of course this doesn't mean that it can be ruled out for all future. Okay? Now, there are people which are considered very scientific-minded, very clever, very critical people who are opposed to GMO, and one of those is Nassim Nicholas Taleb. I don't know if you know.
Yeah. He's called me a fucking moron already.
And so he, I mean, for those who don't know him, he's written popular science books like Fooled by Randomness and The Black Swans, or about risk and such stuff. And he says that when taking risk, we have to look not only on the probability that some harmful event occurs, but only on the probable impact of such a harmful act. And he says if even if there's a tiny probability some harmful event is devastating and not reversible, then we should let the precautionary principle work and not let such things happen. And the foremost example he mentions is GMO. What do you say?
The reason he called me a fucking moron, whatever it was because I objected to that. Because it's not. There was a paper he wrote which was quite unintelligible, but he was basically trying to fool people with statistics and with the black swan argument. So he's saying, I have no evidence of risk, but for some reason or other, I think it's terribly risky, and therefore we should ban it for all time. I mean, that was basically the argument. But where was, show me the evidence. We've got 30 years of safe use, trillions of meals have been eaten, billions of hectares of genetically modified crops of one variety or another have been grown all around the world. So we've had quite a lot of evidence to go on already. So why make the black swan argument as if this is something completely novel? Like, it was completely novel back in the 1970s. And the scientists, by the way, were the first ones to raise the red flag, and they had a voluntary moratorium on recombinant DNA research with pathogens, viruses and stuff. They had a conference at Sillamar. They were the ones the scientists within the community were the ones who first came up with the biosafety regulations. So actually, I think they were very aware of the possibility that recombinant DNA had such novelty that it might have some catastrophic impact. But now we know that actually recombinant DNA is all over the place, right? That viruses and bacteria are constantly exchanging genetic material. You have horizontal gene transfer between species, not all the time, but it certainly happens quite regularly. Agrobacterium, which is used as the genetic engineering vector, it exists by moving its DNA into the DNA of the plant cell. So the idea that I think the scientists started out with, that this was the first time since life evolved that there'd been recombinant DNA, they didn't know then that was not true. So Taleb is 30 years out of date, and he's using an emotional, intuitive argument when really we should be looking at the science.
So when I talk to people about GMOs, I get the impression that they are not so much worried about health issues anymore than they're about political issues, that is to say the monopolization of seeds, and that it gets more tempting to seed the same seeds year after year, so monoculture getting more intense. And I even have the impression that the green movements don't argue so much anymore with health issues, but more more those kinds of decisions and possible roads that it lead down. So how would you respond to those?
Let's ask the Green Movement whether they accept the scientific consensus on safety. The day that they say yes, we can move the debate on to the other political issues. But they never have. And Greenpeace confirmed to me quite recently they do not accept that there's a scientific consensus on GMO safety. I mean, and you've got Seralini, you've got all of the kind of bad science that's been done to try and defend that, and all of the damage that that does in developing countries in particular. And yes, of course, there's political arguments about who owns the seed, and these are not things that you can resolve with a meta. Well, actually, meta-analysis can be useful for looking at the sociological impacts as well. But I'm saying a scientific consensus from the National Academy of Sciences isn't going to give you a political answer to these things. So to that extent, I agree. But when I showed you the pictures of the Bangladeshi farmer, in what way do any of those objections apply to that Bangladeshi farmer? These are seeds which they can save year after year. They're developed and owned in the public sector with no Monsantos or anything like that. They're reducing pesticides. So every single anti-GMO box is ticked off on that thing. And so at least accept that there are some ways, even if you're very suspicious about big corporations or something, first get rid of your cell phone, then come back to me and say, okay, there's at least the possibility of this technology being used for beneficial purposes, because everything has goods and bad applications. You can use a hammer to drive a nail or hit him in the head, you know. It's still a hammer.
So what's the bad one then?
Huh? You need to buy him a beer for that. So yeah, really, I'm not claiming that science can answer all of these political questions, but I'm saying once you get them to accept the scientific consensus, then we can talk seriously about the politics.
Talking about hazardous acts, how afraid are you of bioterrorism? That some idiots use engineering to create a superbug and release it into the wild?
Look, it's a possibility, but there's lots of superbugs out there already, which are very virulent, which evolve naturally. So I think probably the best way to create a superbug is through a billion years of evolutionary arms race, which is kind of what we've got. I'm not really aware. I mean, they've tried doing this with the flu, with the Spanish flu, the outbreak of, with the 1918 pathogen, to resurrect that and try and understand what it was. And you have to be very careful, no doubt, with these things. You don't really want to bring back a flu epidemic which has disappeared. So I think that's it's an issue, but there's probably many worse threats out there, and it's not a reason to ban genetic engineering research, clearly, or crops or anything like that. I mean, it's the same with with chemical weapons. I think a lot of these things are, they are incredibly scary, or even perhaps the best one is the idea of a dirty bomb using radiation, using some nuclear material, and the impact of that would be terror. It would be a proper terrorist thing, because it would create terror far out of proportion to the actual likely damage it would do. You might have a few city blocks which you'd need to decontaminate, but it would really terrorize the whole society because people are so scared of some of these things. And I think bioterror perhaps falls into the same category, but I think it's more scary, more risky than a dirty bomb one anyway.
In the very back.
Have you been personally attacked by people not on grounds of specific issues like GMOs or climate change, but rather on about the being not against science, but against say neo-colonialist view or patronizing other cultures like Tinker or Lindsay, the guy with the bogus papers, Have you been personally attacked on grounds of, let's say, post-modernism, more or less?
I would separate the science from the values on this. So when it comes to my political values, I'm a universalist. So I believe that human rights are universal. I don't believe that people in Syria have less human rights than we do in Austria or the UK. And does that make me a colonialist? Because maybe not every culture accepts that, perhaps, but I'm prepared to defend my values because I think that that human life is sacred in that sense. And I would, in the same way I would defend gay rights in Iran, right? And they might use the same colonial argument and say, well, in our culture, homosexuality is a sin and we need to throw gays off buildings. I think that's immoral, I think that's wrong. And I would stand up to them and I would say that. And, you know, the science thing is a bit different, though. I've heard many of the anti-GMO groups say that Africa's not ready for GMOs. We're not ready for these modern technologies. And I think that's much worse and much more colonialist, saying that there's something backward about Africa, that they're not able to make decisions for themselves about what kinds of seeds their own farmers can grow. So what I try to remember to do is always to speak to people at the grassroots, to speak to farmers like that lady you saw there, and actual genuine farming representatives, and say, what do you want? And oftentimes when you do that, they don't say, I want GMOs. Like, you know, I was doing this in Tanzania, and I was visiting, just going around and driving around and speaking to farmers, and I'd say to them, I wouldn't say anything about GMOs. I'd say, what do you want? What would really improve your life? And because of the drought, they would say irrigation. I want someone to come and drill a borehole so I can water my crops. Because if you think about it, that's a better solution than genetically modified drought-tolerant maize, because they get more options. You can grow tomatoes, you can grow lots of different things if you have water. So you always have to try to remember. And there's a case in my book as well where I went to, this was also in a different part of Tanzania, and this farmer, this lady, was really suffering because the cassava crop, which is a staple crop for them, has been suffering virus infestations, brown streak virus, for example. And these people had nothing to eat, literally. It was so painful to go and visit them and to see the, you know, just see the hunger in the kids' eyes. I mean, it's not something you and I see on a daily basis, and I found it very difficult to do that. And so I was saying, well, you know, when I wrote it up, that she needs GMO virus-resistant cassava, she can feed her family, and stuff like that. And that's a very straightforward case to make, but it's also simplistic. Because I did something which you almost never do, which is I went back 3 years later to visit the same woman whose family was close to starvation almost, because they didn't have the cassava. And you know what? She was better off. They had a new house, she had a new business going, she was selling mangoes. Because there was a big mango tree in her yard. And so people are endlessly resilient, and there's so many different ways that they can improve their livelihoods if you let them. And for me, and it just was a humble lesson to me to remember not to come and project my own issue onto like a victim person and tell them and say that's what they wanted, that's what they needed. Because life's not like that. It wouldn't be the same for you and I if that was the case. Life's much more complicated. So I think when we have these scientific debates as well, we have to remember it's not just, you know, always just think that we think people would make people better that they need. It's much more complicated. And we have to remember to listen to what ordinary people's views are on these things.
One last urgent question.
A couple of minutes ago you said that social media could be used to communicate scientific ideas, and now obviously social media can also be used to spread lots of nonsense, right? So what is your assessment of the overall role that social media plays in this anti-scientific movement?
Well, the Chinese used to have a saying, you have to use the tools of the barbarians to fight the barbarians. And I feel the same way about Facebook. So Facebook I don't use personally. I don't like posting personal family stuff on it particularly. But I do use it as a I almost said propaganda, sorry, communications tool. And because there's been a lot of work that shows, unfortunately, that these social media tend to almost radicalize, that people share information or fake information which confirms their biases, and you tend to get this polarization effect. And there's nothing really we can do about that. It is what it is, and that's the way that the media communications environment has moved in the last few decades. And there's been goods and bads about that, of course. So let's work with what we've got and just try to make sure that the scientific voice, the evidence-based perspective, and reason and progress is reflected in that, so that we can build our own communities and we can feel some strength in what we've got in common. That it's not just how many people are in this room out of the whole population of Austria who will defend reason and evidence-based perspective on GMOs. It starts with this 100 and then goes on to be 500, and next thing you know, you've got a real movement. And that's what we have to do to defend science at the moment against this tide of populism, this tide of anti-science. We have to defend a movement of evidence-based thinking and a movement of reason. And we can use social media to do that, because that's a way that we can all communicate and we can organise together. But for me, it's been a return almost to my activist roots. That you can't just disappear into a library and write about science. You've also got to fight. You've got to be out there on the streets. You've got to march, and you've got to defend it.
One argument of GMO opponents always was unknown long-term effects. I think maybe, Mark, you underestimated the long-term effects of your speech in 2013 at the farming conference. In any case, we were recording the talk. Speaking of social media, we recorded the talk on video, and we will publish it on our YouTube channel, Skeptics in the Pub Wien. We already have more than 600 subscribers, and you are invited to also subscribe. We will put the video online as soon as possible. And I would like to announce the upcoming talks in our series. The next one will be by science buster Elisabeth Oberzaucher, about Sex und Gender zwischen Biologie und Gesellschaft on April 11. On May 9 we will have the honor to welcome Franz Wuketitz. He will speak about another topic that sits between biology and society, namely, so the title is Moral biologisch bedingt? And on June 4 we will have a special talk by Lydia Benecke with the title Satanic Panic Reloaded, eine Zeitreise mit aktuellen Entwicklungen. So I hope there's something interesting for you among these talks in this program. I'm looking forward to seeing you again. That's it for the talk and the discussion. But it's not everything for the evening. We reserve tables upstairs. You are invited to continue discussing with Mark and with us for get together. And we are looking forward to seeing you again. And stay skeptical, my friends.